Hi, and welcome to another Liberty Elevated, the ACLU of Utah's podcast, where we talk about the issues and solutions that affect the lives and liberties of people that live here. I'm Billy Palmer. I'm the organizing manager.
And I'm Lila Mahmood, Legislative and Policy Counsel.
So in this episode, we'll be providing a legislative report from 2023's general session work. We'll cover some of the issues and bills that were on the top of our priorities. All of the legislative work that we did this year couldn't possibly fit into one podcast. In fact, it would probably take about 20 podcasts, if that.
It was a lot of work, busy session.
Very much so. And it was a difficult one. If you would like to review a more in-depth scope of the ACLU's work this year, you can find our legislative report on the website at acluutah.org. So, Lila, you want to talk about what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So like Billy said, we did a lot of work during this legislative session covering a lot of different issue areas. So some of that work included curriculum censorship, LGBTQ plus rights, reproductive rights and reproductive freedoms, voting rights, criminal legal reform, and Indigenous justice. But in this episode today, we're going to focus on the work we did surrounding LGBTQ plus rights, reproductive rights, and curriculum censorship. So we're going to start with curriculum censorship. That was a really popular topic this year, not only in Utah, but in a lot of places across the country. We saw a lot of bills about curriculum censorship.
It's a major trend in legislative work throughout the country. A lot of it was very difficult for us to work through, and some of this, we opposed a lot of the bills around curriculum.
Yeah, it was a lot of defensive work for us at the ACLU. So some of the curriculum censorship work we did could kind of be set up into two different categories. The sensitive materials bills that were a follow-up to the big sensitive material bill that was passed last session, and then a lot of these kind of like EDI, equity and inclusion bills that were targeting important but challenging conversations that are being had in the classroom. So we can start with a bill called HB 427, which is a bill that the ACLU of Utah felt so strongly about that we wrote a veto letter asking Governor Cox to veto the bill. He did not. It was signed and passed into law. And this is one of those divisive concepts bills that's kind of going around the nation, where essentially what it does is it restricts teachers' abilities to have honest and truthful and important conversations about challenging parts of American history, about things about students' identities that are really important to talk about. I think, just to name it, we're specifically talking about addressing racism in schools,
right?
Racism in our community, but talking about it in school, addressing LGBTQ plus identities in schools, kind of anything that is outside of what we might think of as the status quo in schools.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the most disturbing part for us was the initial bill was watered down a little bit from some of that language, but some of it was still left in there. And this whole notion that meritocracy and some of the things that we talk about, if they offend or make a person feel bad, then it shouldn't be said in classrooms. Yeah. And quite honestly, our history in America can be uncomfortable, but specifically addressing some of the disparities that we see in America, not allowing teachers or making it confusing for a teacher to be able to say that those disparities are because of some of our racist or sexist or anti-LGBTQ policy and all of that. So that's why we opposed it and wrote that veto letter.
Yeah, this is one of those bills that's like further showing that we don't trust teachers to do their job, essentially, to handle these kinds of conversations that they're trained to have in schools. So that was the first bill. And then there were several other bills that kind of followed the same theme of restricting the way that teachers can teach certain concepts in school. So one of that was SB 283. That was a bill that did not pass. So that was it passed in an amended form, but it didn't do what it was planning to do. We also had a interesting bill, HB 441, which was the same concept. It was a neutrality in schools bill, very strange. And then there was the original version of HB 550, which was restricting the ability to talk about gender identity in schools up to a certain age. That was also amended. So then the next kind of group of these curriculum censorship bills I'm calling the sensitive materials bills, which are a continuation of the sensitive material bill that passed last year. So kind of the big one this year was HB 464. We came out really hard against that bill. It included a lot of really terrible things. It included a book rating system. It included a cause of actions for parents to sue LEAs if the book that they thought should be removed from schools wasn't removed. And I think the big kind of constitutional issue that we had with that bill was the removal of books that are flagged as sensitive materials before the complete review can be completed, which is, like, there are many books that if you look at them and you read one sentence, you could be like, oh, this seems like sensitive material. But then when you read the book as a whole, it is a completely different context.
Right. And there's so many of those books in our libraries. There's so many of those books we read in our classrooms with our teachers and the rest of our students. We were assigned some of these books that are now in question.
Yeah. And luckily that bill didn't pass, but kind of the core idea behind these sensitive materials bills is the kinds of books that are being flagged and removed are specifically about Black and brown characters by Black and brown authors, about LGBTQ plus characters and by LGBTQ plus authors. And that's the reality of what books are being banned in Utah.
So it essentially comes down to book banning.
Yeah. That's what this is. Yeah. So some of those sensitive materials books or bills that we saw was HB 464, which did not pass, HB 465, which passed but in an amended version that we think we could live with, and then HB 55, which is more about transparency, like requiring instructional materials to be posted online and have parents be more part of the process of what instructional materials could be. And this again kind of comes down to the same concepts of not trusting teachers to teach, restricting the amount of information that can be had in schools and restricting really important conversations from being had in schools.
Yeah, and the narrative around some of this, it really, the hard part is that there's characterizations of teachers of things like grooming or, comparisons to very terrible things that teachers, by and large, are there to make sure our kids are in a safe and educational environment.
Yeah.
And the characterization of teachers and librarians and educators all together, there's not a lot we can do around the way other people talk about folks, but we want to create a different narrative about that and a more true narrative about that. And so some of our grassroots work was really to back up our teachers, back up our librarians. And so we want to thank all the folks that joined in with us on our grassroots efforts by packing in committees and coming and providing testimony. We had educators and teachers and parents that showed up to say, hey, wait a minute, and it's important. It's very important, even though some of these bills, they pass or they don't pass, that those voices are in the room. Those voices are also providing for this. And we also started a whole new coalition called Let Utah Read. And you can go to letutahread.com and check out that website and get more involved if you're concerned about book banning. But Let Utah Read was a great coalition, and we had a demonstration in the rotunda of the Capitol called a read-in. Yeah. And that was that turned out to be and again, thank you to all the people that showed up to the read-in. That was fantastic. But we sat and reread many of these books that have been banned here in Utah, and we had a couple authors that came that have been banned in some of these school districts as well. So we want to thank you for that, for showing up for that, and also the work of the entire coalition. So that was some of the grassroots around that. That was some of the bills around that. Should we read? Should we read? Yes, we should read. But we should move on to what's the next subject here?
Reproductive rights.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the reproductive rights, this was a very difficult one. I think on the top of a lot of people's mind is HB 467.
Yeah.
And that bill is very broad and restricts a lot. And we're still working through, and our partners and the very many people around that bill are still trying to get all the analysis together so that we can communicate that to people on what that bill does and doesn't do. So that work is still being done to interpret that bill. But
so HB 467 was the big abortion bill that I think we were all expecting this legislative session, that there was going to be a big abortion bill like this. I don't think any of us were anticipating it was going to be as bad as this. But pretty much what we feel comfortable saying about HB 467 right now is that it is a functional ban of abortions in Utah. And that's kind of where we're at. That's what our legislators did this session is, they were slowly cutting away at abortion and reproductive rights in Utah for years. And then we had Roe overturned and our trigger ban went into effect. And then now we have HB 467, which is a functional ban on abortion in Utah.
So there are a couple other bills to talk about.
Yeah, mostly bad bills again. Like we said earlier, we did a lot of defensive work this session. It was a difficult session. The other bill that we focused quite a bit on was HB 297. And this bill actually had quite a bit of good things in it, which is why I think a lot of folks who work in the reproductive space did support this bill. We did not support this bill primarily because the thing we were most worried about is in our current abortion trigger ban, you are restricted access to people who get pregnant are not allowed to access an abortion after 18 weeks, except for certain exceptions. And those exceptions include rape or incest. So this bill essentially requires that an individual has to report to law enforcement in order to access that exception. And kind of the language around this bill was confusing, and that was one piece of many other pieces. So I think that's why a lot of folks in the reproductive space actually came out supporting this bill or neutral on this bill because of those other things. For example, requiring that information on emergency contraception be provided to people who experience sexual assault, who could potentially get pregnant. Things like that were codified in this bill. And I think people were saying, hey, that's a good thing, but then it also included this bad stuff, like many bills at the legislature. They include a lot of information. So that was one of the bills. Another one that we did a lot of work on was HJR 2. This was a really interesting way that the legislature attacked abortion here in Utah, because what it did is it reformed the standards for preliminary injunctions in Utah. So Utah is unique, where there are two standards under which a preliminary injunction can be granted, and one of them is the serious question standard. And that is how our current abortion litigation preliminary injunction was decided. It was decided under the serious question standard. What this bill did was take away the serious question standard. So that was another kind of, honestly, insidious way to attack abortion rights here in Utah by attacking it from kind of the court proceeding process. So we actually did have some positive legislation around reproductive rights this session, actually a couple of bills, but I'm just going to speak on one of them because, there's, like we said at the top, there's so many things we could talk about. And that's HB 429, which is a bill that creates space for the Department of Corrections to allow for a nursery program for incarcerated pregnant women and postpartum, women who just gave birth for their infants, which is kind of a revolutionary idea. And it addresses a lot of these issues that we find that involve pregnant people who are incarcerated and works to address some of those issues. So that was one positive piece of legislation in the reproductive rights space that passed this session.
And again, there was a number of things that we did within partnership with a lot of folks that were working around reproductive rights. It's always a huge focus for us here in Utah and throughout the country. For the ACLU, as many and so many other folks, physicians and clinics and all of that stuff. And so we should really thank all the people that worked to try to minimize damage, try to reduce harm. We don't want to see these types of bills passed. We don't want to see these kinds of laws. The ACLU will continue to do as much work as is necessary. And it's going to be a fight for quite some time, and that is the reality of it, isn't it not? Yeah. Another thing that's going to be something that I think we're going to be focusing on and fighting for quite some time is anti-LGBTQ plus bills. And there's a lot of focus in the state right now around trans folks and especially trans youth.
Yeah.
Do you want to kind of
we'll continue with the difficult stuff.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of anti-LGBTQ plus bills this session, like you said. We started off the session really intensely with SB 16. SB 16 was originally introduced as a bill that was only banning affirming surgery for trans youth. So colloquially, we could call it top and bottom surgery for trans youth, and then was amended, in the way that it moves through the session, was amended to also to ban hormone therapy for trans youth, which is just incredibly restrictive. It includes so many things to be restricting that kind of affirming care for trans youth. And that's how we started the session, with that piece of legislation passing through in 2 weeks or something.
Yeah, from day one, from the start, those were on the schedule. It was unusual legislation in that way. The very first week was heavy and hard, and usually that's a little more ceremonious, and there's the work starts to, but they ramped in right away.
They knew what they were doing. And then Governor Cox signed the bill pretty immediately, which is interesting, because last year when we had the bill about trans access for trans youth to engage in sports, he vetoed the bill. So I guess that's kind of an interesting thing to be thinking about.
Yeah, it is.
But so SB 16, a huge attack on the trans community and specifically trans youth. And we're still navigating what that means for trans Utahns here, and, what we can do in that front. Another bill, kind of positive, not a good bill, but a bad bill that didn't pass, was HB 329. So this has been touted as the anti-drag show bill, where it would require organizations that are applying for event permits to potentially be labeled as an adult-themed event. For us, this had huge First Amendment concerns, like labeling content, engaging in viewpoint discrimination. We had a lot of conversations with folks at the legislature, with the sponsor, about this bill. And ultimately, finally, they realized that, there was very few people who were supporting this who are from a constitutional background, who understood the kind of effect that this bill was going to have. So that was a piece of legislation that did not pass, but we are expecting this kind of stuff to come back year after year. We've seen that there's been a lot of attacks on drag shows specifically across the country. So I think this is something we can expect to see again. And,
Yeah, we will, and it's just a little strange that if, say, I were to put on lipstick, it becomes an adult theme.
Right, exactly.
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
First Amendment is very clear about...
I know. This was a pretty clear First Amendment violation, so, it's interesting that it made it as far as it did. And then kind of the last group of LGBTQ plus bills we're going to talk about today are birth certificate bills. There were 2 that passed this session. We wrote veto letters for both of them. One was SB 93, which started out, the original version of the bill was a very broad ban on trans youth being able to amend their birth certificates to reflect their gender, for any trans youth under the age of 18. And it was extremely broad. So it was narrowed and became a little bit more permissive, but still ultimately the effect that it has is it bans trans minors from being able to amend their birth certificate if they're under the age of 15 and a half, and then puts in place a bunch of restrictions and burdens that specifically only trans individuals have to go through in order to have their birth certificate reflect who they truly are. So, that's, I don't know, terrible, and makes us feel bad. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and then one more birth certificate bill. So there were a couple actually bills about requiring birth certificates for students to play sports. And this was kind of a follow-up on the bill from last year, the ban on, trans girls from being able to play sports. And this bill specifically, HB 209, requires birth certificates of individuals of middle schoolers and high schoolers, I believe, if they want to play sports. And that is a clear restriction on trans youth, but it's also a restriction on so many different groups. There are a couple exceptions for youth experiencing homelessness and youth of a certain immigration status, but it's still so broad that it would scoop in so many different kids who just don't know where their birth certificates are, right, or how to access them, and not allow them to play sports.
It's a lot of our community.
Yeah.
You have folks that are, adopted. You have folks that are
from out of state, from a different country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it complicates what something that just things that don't need any more complication.
Yeah. What we see is that legislators are creating legislation specifically about groups of people, in this case, trans youth, and they're legislating for that group of people, which in and of itself is horrible. But they're also scooping in, because they're so targeted and focused on discriminating against this group of people, they're scooping in all other people, even though we tell them, hey, this is a really broad bill that's going to scoop in a lot of kids that I don't know if that's your intention or not. So,
right. It's something to think about, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, anytime we see an issue where we're seeing discrimination, if we think it's not affecting us, it ultimately will. It ultimately does.
That's how that works.
Yeah, that's basically how it works. We're all in the same boat. And if you start putting holes in the boat, we're all going to go down in the boat.
We sink together, yeah.
We sink together, we rise together.
Right.
That brings up, for me, some of the work that we saw around LGBTQ plus rights that was a positive. And that was actually, for me, was especially, we saw a lot of young trans folks being visible, showing up, getting involved in the legislative process, going to committee, testifying, making sure that their voices were heard.
Yeah.
We had a rally that was well attended, and so many trans folks showed up and were visible, and all of the supporters that came along with that is something that I feel like, even though we lose some battles, that was one of the things that like we hope to see in the future, because really this is about erasure.
Yeah.
And there's certain things you cannot legislate. You can't legislate people's identities away from them. You can't legislate their joy. No, you can't legislate people's joy away from them.
Yeah.
You can't legislate people's need and want for community, and you can't legislate communities.
Yeah.
And so we really feel so grateful in being able to be partnered in with so much of that work, but also just for showing up to the rallies that we organize and some of the pack the committee moments that we had. We sort of went through that very intentionally and made sure that there was support around everything that we were doing. But we were just floored by so many people that are tired of being discriminated against, tired of having legislation written against them, and showed up to say so.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have that, you can't expect that you're going to get anywhere unless you start getting involved. And democracy is not a participation; it's a participation sport, right?
Yeah.
It's not something that you watch.
Yeah.
It's something that you have to be involved in. And so you cannot say enough for the community of young trans folks here in Utah that showed up, organized multiple demonstrations, and did so much work around this legislation. And honestly, I hope that we see that from going forward, because that's really where we have to make those changes, is within our community. If the legislation is not listening to you, we just have to get more and more people and change things for ourselves. So I'm still so inspired by all those young folks that showed up. And it was really difficult to sit in those committees and have people talk to you about you in the ways that they were being spoken about. And that's not
hateful.
It was mean. It was mean.
And
we just want to say thank you. And we want to say that the ACLU will always be behind you and will always be there to work alongside you. So thank you for everything you did. And that is specific for the entire LGBTQ plus community that showed up this year.
Yeah. And we're not done fighting.
We're not.
We are not done fighting.
No. Yeah. Legislation does not end at the end of the legislative session for us. It is just one part of the phases of legislation and bills, and everybody knows the ACLU does a lot of work in every arena that we can possibly defend people's rights, and so that's what we will continue to do.
Yeah.
So there are a few other subjects to talk about here real briefly, but those are the three main ones that you mentioned. What else did you want to talk about?
So like we said at the beginning, we did so much work this legislative session, we wouldn't have time to talk about it all. But some of the other bills that we worked a lot on were voting rights bills. Like it seems every year there's going to be attack on our vote by mail here in Utah, and we were able to successfully defend against those attacks this year. So we still have vote by mail, so that's a good thing. Like always, we engage in criminal reform work. There were like every year, there was a lot of bills about criminal reform. We worked on some bills that were, maybe watered down, but still some good ones that pass. And then, every year there's good and bad bills that pass. Another area we worked in was Indigenous justice. There was one bill in particular we were trying to support to the best of our ability, which was HB 40, which would have codified the federal ICWA into state code. That bill did not pass, which was, I think, a shock to a lot of us because it has so much support during interim. And that is something that would have protected Indigenous communities in spite of whatever happens with the Burkina v. Holland case that we're expected to hear the opinion from this summer. So that was a disappointment for us. And then there was an interesting group of, I'm just calling them like the EDI bills that came up this session they kind of came up at the end that we were trying to engage with quite a bit. And pretty much none of them passed in their full worst forms. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of also another win for us.
Right. But when we say at the end of general session, we're really kind of talking also about the beginning of the interim sessions.
That's right. Yeah.
So we'll probably see some of those efforts to get rid of EDIB work in workplaces, in schools, and higher education and lower education, not lower education, but K through 12.
Yeah.
So we'll be vigilant about that, obviously.
Yeah.
We can expect to see more of that work. So again, that is just some of the legislative work this year, as there was a lot of conversations to be had about the constitutional and civil rights of people living here and the 8 sovereign nations as well in this state. This year was a tough fight, and it doesn't stop at the end of the general session for us, obviously. We will continue the work in every way within our power to defend the lives and liberties of the people through partnership and with the guidance of our many communities. If you would like to get much more in-depth view of our legislative session this year, visit our website at acluutah.org. And of course, you can find us on all of our social media platforms at ACLU of Utah. This is Liberty Elevated. A special thanks to our producer, Nathan Wichlak, and I'm Billy Palmer, community organizer and organizing manager here.
I'm Laila Mahmood, Legislative and Policy Counsel.
And until we meet again, keep up the fight.